Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, students. I am Dr. Zia, and I hope you all are fine and taking very good care of yourselves and your families. So, our today's agenda is to discuss a very fundamental model of consumer behavior. Students, this model is important from two perspectives. One, this model provides us the essence of consumer behavior. Second, this model gives a very brief outline of the discipline of consumer behavior. So, before going into the detail of the consumer behavior model, I want to share with you two very interesting definitions of consumer behavior. The first definition is very basic and fundamental definition, a very good beginning or start to understand consumer behavior. So, this definition explains consumer behavior along five aspects. One is searching for a product, second one is buying a product, third one is consuming or using a product, fourth one is evaluating the products, and the last one is disposing of products. So, if you want to understand consumer buyer behavior, so you have to start with understanding how do consumers search for your products being a marketeer. Second, how what is the buying process? Third, how do they consume the products and how do they evaluate your products? By evaluating means before buying evaluations, after buying evaluations, before consumption evaluation and post consumption evaluations, and what are the standards along with the use to evaluate your products. And last one is disposing of the products. By disposing of, we mean how do they put the products into the trash or how do they resell the product. So all these are covered under this aspect of consumer behavior definition that is called disposing of the products. So this is very fundamental definition of consumer behavior. So the next one is uh, more about the decision making. So this definition says that uh, consumer behavior is a science of internal and external factors that affect consumers in their decision making process. So, here the most fundamental aspect of this definition is decision making process. And so, what are the factors? Internal and external. These are two types of factors, and how these factors influence or impact the decision making process. So, if you are successful to understand these internal and external factors that can affect consumer decision making process, then you will be successful to understand the consumer buyer behavior. Students, here by internal factors we mean the inner factors that are called psychological factors of consumer behavior that deals with the consumer's mind, and by external factors we mean all other factors like socio-cultural, economic, political, or whatever. All these factors are called external factors. So by the consumer decision making is influenced by these two types of factors. So this is little bit more detailed definition of consumer behavior, a more tricky one. So now I would move to the model of consumer buyer behavior. It is called SR model of buyer behavior. SR stands for stimulus response. Stimulus response. So stimulus is something that will initiate the response in consumers. Stimulus is some factor that will trigger the response in consumers. So anything that can trigger response is called stimulus. So here, this model has three components. The first one is called the stimulus, the other is called the response, and the third one is called the black box. So if I try to explain this model, so I would say that by stimulus, I mean there are many types of stimuli. These are divided into two major categories. One is marketing stimuli and other stimuli. By marketing stimuli, we mean the four P's. This is called marketing mix. Marketing mix, product, price, place, promotion. All these activities that are collectively called as marketing mix. So these are one group of stimuli that can create some responses in consumers. And among other stimuli, we can say that these are economic, technological, political, and cultural factors that can influence or that can create responses within the consumers. So all these stimuli can influence buyers and they can create responses among buyers. So, what are these responses? These responses are actually consumer decisions. So, these stimuli will affect or will influence consumers, and in response, consumer will make some choices or decisions. So, what are these decisions? The product choice, which brand, which product to buy, which brand to choose, which dealer to choose, online, offline, which I would say which store to buy the product. Then what will be the purchase timings? Another choice, another decision. And the last one is purchase amount. What quantity to of the product to buy. So ये सारे के सारे जो responses हैं ये वो responses हैं जो consumer show करता है against all these stimuli. But before these okay, let me make one thing clear over here. So we can understand all these stimuli and we can understand all these responses. But one thing that is intermediary over here is buyer's black box. So in simple words, I would say that by buyer's black box, here we mean the consumer's mind. That is very important because all these stimuli will affect consumer, will affect actually consumer mind, and consumer mind will make some decisions and will generate these responses. So we cannot directly look into the consumer's mind. It's very difficult to understand consumer's mind. However, we have another choice uh, to to decode this black box because it is very difficult to see inside the black box. However, we can decode the black box. So this model provides us uh, the way to decode this black box. So what is that methodology? So if you are able to understand the characteristics of consumer, then you will be able to understand the consumer's mind because जो कंज्यूमर माइंड है वो ग्रो होता है वो डेवलप होता है under the influence of these characteristics. So actually these characteristics reflect the consumer mind or black box. Second, if you can unfold the decision making process of consumers, then you can predict the consumer's mind, or you can make a judgment about the consumer mind. So here are two very important factors that are very fundamental to this SR model of buyer behavior: buyer characteristics and buyer decision making. So if we are successful in understanding buyer characteristics and buyer decision making process, then we will be successful to understand the buyer behavior. So in the very next slide, here we have a detail of all those characteristics that are fundamental to the consumer. So these characteristics start from the cultural factors, then social factors, then personal factors, then psychological factors. And if we can understand all these factors successfully, so these factors will lead us toward the understanding of buyer. So here we will be successful to understand the buyer. So we have to start from the cultural factors because these are very broader factors. For example, हम कहते हैं जी this is the culture of Pakistan. तो जो जो बायर है चूंकि वो पाकिस्तान में रहा है, वो पंजाब के कल्चर में, वो बलोचिस्तान के कल्चर में या वो सिंध के कल्चर में उस बायर का ब्रॉटअप हुआ है, तो उसका जो सारा माइंड है उसकी कोडिंग उस कल्चर के जेरे असर हुई है. एंड इफ यू कैन अंडरस्टैंड दैट कल्चर, that will guarantee that you can understand the buyer and the choice and the decision making of buyer. Similarly, social factors, जो reference groups हैं, family है, these are influencers. So if you can uh, understand these influencers, you can predict the buyer decision making, you can predict the buyer behavior. And same like the personal factors, these are also influencers, these also influence the consumer buying process, consumer choices. And lastly, the psychological factors. These psychological factors are internal factors like motivation, perception, learning, beliefs, and attitudes. If you are successful to understand the psychological factors, then it would be very easy to understand the buyer and the buyer decision making process. When you move to the left side of this model, these characteristics, we see very broader and general characteristics like culture, social, etc. But when we move to the right hand side, we get very specific, we get very narrower, and we go to the personal and then psychological factors of the individual buyers. So the whole of the consumer behavior discipline revolves around understanding these characteristics of consumer behavior. So if you are successful to understand or to explain all these characteristics that are very particular to consumer behavior, so then we can we can successfully deal the discipline of consumer behavior. So the last one is a model of consumer decision making. So here we have some external factors. So as I already shared with you that I will later on explain the external influencer or external factors. So यहाँ पे आप देख सकते हैं कि ये जो आपके मार्केटिंग मिक्स है या अदर स्टिमुलाई हैं, all these are external influencers. और जो psychological factors हैं, these are internal factors. So all these external and internal factors actually influence this consumer decision making process. So consumer decision making process starts with need recognition, then consumer uh, uh, gets involved in pre-purchase search, then evaluation of alternatives. We find multiple products. For example, if you want to buy a smartphone, you have many alternatives, like you have Samsung, you have Asus, you have Apple iPhone, etc. So you have to choose one of these alternatives, and this process is influenced by these external factors and internal factors as well. So once you have a set of alternatives, then you will go for purchase and post purchase evaluations. So by post purchase evaluations, we mean that after buying and consuming the product, so what are our evaluations? So here you can see that these are the inputs, which are external factors, and then we process these this information that we receive from external influences and the internal influences. We process the information and we make some choices or decisions. ये हमारी इसको हम आउटपुट कहते हैं. So this is very fundamental model of consumer decision making process. So in our advanced stage of this course, we will explain this model in greater details. So however, here I give you very brief introduction of this decision making model just as a part of the SR model of consumer buyer behavior. Students, it was all about our 2 days class. So here I tried my best to explain the stimulus response model of consumer buyer behavior and how this model provides us the fundamental outline of consumer behavior discipline. Thank you very much. Have a very good time. Take care of yourself.